Do you know who the Praetorians were? The Praetorian Corps. Maybe if those watching us are from Rome, or at least know Rome, they've definitely heard of the Castra Praetoria. Basically, they were the barracks where the soldiers were stationed, closely guarding the emperor, first the princeps and then the emperor, to properly respect Roman history. The Praetorians were selected soldiers, chosen from within the various legions. They became Praetorians thanks to their great physical strength and their proven extreme loyalty. The men who were in closest contact, in direct contact with those who held command. The term Praetorians has basically been copied up to the present day, especially in authoritarian regimes where the dictator, the strong man in command, needs to surround himself with trusted people, and above all, with soldiers who are loyal to him until death. It's common to say Praetorian Guard when referring to the personal guard of the strong man in command. In modern times, there have been several examples of Praetorian Guards, but probably none have ever reached the heights attained by the infamous Waffen-SS. The Schutzstaffeln established themselves within the Nazi regime, in step with the rise to power of the National Socialist Party and therefore of Adolf Hitler, to Pepe Peku and Shimune. Increasingly important, they replaced the Sturmabteilung in terms of significance within the core of the future regime, becoming first and foremost Hitler's bodyguards, ensuring his safety. And it's no coincidence that it is the SS who are on the front lines during the night. We have already talked about this in a dedicated video that you can find on the channel. SS versus Sturmabteilung. Do you remember why the Sturmabteilung were eliminated? For a pretty simple reason: power. Their founder, Ernst Röhm, wanted more and more power. He even wanted to turn the Sturmabteilung into a real army, perhaps by replacing the Reichswehr, which did not look favorably on the matter. The SS initially did not want to become a paramilitary army, so they gained favor both from the emerging regime and from the elite of the old army, heir to Prussian traditions. But over time, things change. Remember these three elders, Joseph Sepp, Dietrich, Theodor Eck, Kurt Saarlüge? Did you note them all? All three were SS members involved in the Night of the Long Knives Purge. Sepp Dietrich is a big name, large and strong, a fighter, a great expert in tactics and combat. The great organizer, Eck, is Hitler's favorite bodyguard, together with his driver, Emil Moritz Saarlüge. He is placed in charge of what remains of the Sturmabteilung right after the purge of Rome and all the other Sturmabteilung leaders. These three members, together with a fourth officer who comes from the army, Paul Hauser, form the original core of the Waffen-SS, a corps that arises within a very specific formation. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. What is the Leibstandarte? Simply put, it is the security regiment assigned as Hitler's personal guard, a Praetorian Guard in the true sense of the word, the Leibstandarte. It is made up of very strong soldiers, physically well-trained, who swear an oath of exclusive loyalty to Hitler himself. Dietrich's idea involves Hitler and two SS members, and in the end, it also sees the participation of Hauser, who is basically involved, initially as the training inspector. The Leibstandarte was officially established on June 30, 1934, and then evolved within a year and a half into a real military unit. Moreover, it's not just the members of the Leibstandarte. Within the SS, there is also the Totenkopfverband. It basically means the branch of the SS marked by the death's head and symbol. Maybe you've seen it on the headgear, on the caps of many SS members. The death's head distinguished the SS members dedicated to the management and supervision of concentration camps. They were supposed to take with them to the grave and beyond the secret of what happened inside those camps. Members of the Death's Head were given the opportunity to gradually become members of the future Waffen-SS as well. But at this point, we're not exactly talking about combat SS yet. That's what Waffen means. They preferred to keep them in reserve, essentially as support for the regular army. Paul Hauser is assigned to inspect and supervise the establishment of this first unit. It starts from the Leibstandarte and evolves with training schools, regiments, and formation brigades. From that moment on, from 1936 until the invasion of Poland in September 1939, the first formations of the future Waffen-SS essentially remained in the rear. They don't take action. They are involved in the occupation of Austria, in the Anschluss, and in that of the Sudetenland. But they never fire a shot. So they can't prove themselves to be reliable, not so much from an ideological point of view, but rather from a strictly military perspective. They are not yet, at least from a strictly tactical analysis, the equivalent of the volunteer militia for national security in Italy, that militia formed from the fascist black shirts which obtained the status of a fighting force, to the point that the legions sent to Ethiopia to conquer Ethiopia are often disguised, even though they are regular army units, as militia. And not only that, with the advancement and especially the reorganization of the Royal Army, almost all divisions are reinforced, strengthened by a legion of black shirts, partly to test the loyalty of the Italian army and its large units to the regime. But that's another story. If the black shirts have the opportunity in any case to put themselves to the test, especially on a military level, on an operational theater, first in Ethiopia, then in Spain, and finally, already at the outbreak of the Second World War, the Waffen-SS, or rather those who would become the Waffen-SS, have to be patient. They have to wait for the invasion of France. Only at that moment will the various formations, starting with the Leibstandarte, which at that time is transforming from a guard regiment into a real division, first mechanized and then armored. Only at that moment, as I was saying, do they begin to take part in the fighting. Initially in the rear, as reserves, then gradually they go into action. The first opportunity is in Utrecht, Netherlands. It's a simple advance. The Dutch are unable to withstand the tremendous force of the Wehrmacht and all the German soldiers. Afterwards, the capture of The Hague, the city that today hosts the International Criminal Court. Then the integration into the 19 Panzer Corps under General Guderian, the legend of armored vehicles, perhaps the most emblematic man within the armored forces, and perhaps also a sign, because from that moment on, in 1940, the Waffen-SS would increasingly have the opportunity to form divisions, first mechanized, grenadiers, and then armored. They grow rapidly and disproportionately along with the atrocities, because while the ordinary German soldier of the Heer, that is, the army, maintains a high code of honor, of course, there are also negative examples of regular German troops who let themselves commit massacres. The Waffen-SS became synonymous with terror. The future members of the Totenkopf Division, for example, carry out a massacre, the Massacre of Les Paradis, May 27, 1940. 99 soldiers of the Royal Norfolk Regiment are mowed down by machine guns after they had surrendered to the Germans. The survivors are stabbed with bayonets. It was a gruesome massacre, and it won't be the only one, not in France, or worse, over a year later on the Eastern Front. In the meantime, as we were saying, the Waffen-SS are growing more and more. They get the opportunity to recruit and form more and more divisions. However, a problem eventually emerges. The Waffen-SS are meant to embody the purest Aryan ideals. So it should also be the manifesto of that racial creed on which the Nazi regime is based. They should all be, or at least the majority, German, pure, tall, blonde, with blue eyes, physically massive, The problem is that if racial selection in Germany is already not easy, imagine during wartime. So after a while, they resort to a trick for recruitment, a trick called Volksdeutschen. Who are they? Well, they are Hungarians, Romanians from Transylvania, Czechs, Croatians, later on people from the Baltics, and then Dutch, Walloons, Flemish, Galicians, even Italians. All people, all ethnicities, who theoretically would have nothing to do with the great Nazi Reich, but who are recognized in one way or another, sometimes in very imaginative ways, as descendants of a lost Germanic lineage, and thus permitted to wear the uniform with twin lightning bolts. By the way, the Waffen-SS remains strictly separate from the army. They have their own uniforms, to the point that they can even be among the first to experiment with camouflage for their insignia. They don't have the classic collar tabs of the Heer, but they wear the twin lightning bolts of their ranks, which are completely different from those of the Heer. Some of their ranks don't match the classic hierarchy, and their titles differ too. It's a Praetorian Corps in every sense, a Praetorian Corps that, as we said before, grows and grows without limits. If you think that in September 1942, basically at the peak of the Reich's expansion with Paulus's Sixth Army approaching Stalingrad, the Waffen-SS had already reached the remarkable strength of 188,000 men. That means almost 19 divisions. Well, a year later they reached 350,000 men. At the height of the effort, the Waffen-SS reached an impressive total of 38 divisions. The main corps is made up of non-German infantry divisions, Volksdeutschen. Then there are the armored units, whose names would be spoken on the battlefields but also in the courtrooms. When will it be time to face justice? The Leibstandarte, the Das Reich, the Totenkopf, and the Viking become particularly notorious for their brutality, both on the battlefields and against civilians and partisans. Then there are two other armored divisions that we have already encountered in another story. The one about Operation Market Garden, the fiasco of Montgomery. You can find the video on the channel. When Montgomery came up with a plan to end the war early, but sent an entire battalion of British paratroopers straight into the jaws of two Waffen-SS armored divisions that were reorganizing at Arles, the Hohenstaufen, and the Frundsberg. Then there are the mountain divisions, divisions designed for mountain warfare. One of these, the Handschar, a German name that means scimitar, was recruited in the Balkans with the interested assistance of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hosseini, a deeply anti-Semitic man who seeks to facilitate the entry of Muslim troops, specifically for anti-Jewish purposes. But they're not the only ones. There's even a case, and we've already talked about this as well, of the Cossack cavalry, which, despite the protests of its commander von Panwitz, at a certain point switches from the OHR insignia to those of the Waffen-SS. This will be an additional death sentence for the Cossacks. Then there are obviously other cavalry divisions, police divisions, mechanized infantry divisions, 38 divisions in total. Much more than just a simple Praetorian Guard, a sort of army competing with the regular army. And also for this reason, referring to another video on the channel, when Colonel von Stauffenberg and the other conspirators of Operation Valkyrie decide to rewrite the Valkyrie plan. They do it by excluding the Waffen-SS because they feared that those troops might not follow them or even get in the way and oppose what they are doing. The conspiracy with weapons in hand. Von Stauffenberg may have also considered an Italian precedent in his calculations. Do you remember? At the beginning, we also talked about the Italian black shirts, the voluntary militia. Well, during the war, Italy sent some units of the militia to the front, even as independent groups. A very particular case is that of the so-called Giovanni Fascisti division, which was sent to North Africa to be massacred. But that's a rare and exceptional case. Then there's the case of the Armored Division M, an armored division that never went into action. It was formed in the summer of 1943, with personnel coming from the militia, entrusted to General Calvi di Bergolo, who, among other things, is a relative of the sovereign Vittorio Emanuele III. It was intended to be equipped with the latest generation of Italian tanks, the P-2640, but also with German equipment, with the Panzers, a division that after the fall of Mussolini was reorganized, renamed, but kept aside even when the first clashes between Italians and Germans took place. Ideological loyalty. It was the division's own commander who could not guarantee the ideological loyalty of the troops and lower-ranking commanders to the king and the government. Following that example and precedent, von Stauffenberg and the other conspirators will exclude the Waffen-SS from the troops involved in Operation Valkyrie. They can't be trusted. It's not worth trying because their plan could fail miserably. The Waffen-SS are ending the war in retreat. Most of these troops are trying to surrender to the Western Allies. The reason is simple. In the East, the Soviets take prisoners from the regular army and the Heer. But if they come across someone with the twin lightning bolts, it's said that they execute them on the spot without a trial. The memory of the massacres is still too vivid. Massacres involving many units, many commanders. We've already come across one of them, Oscar Derlewanger. By the way, you can find his story here on this channel. At Nuremberg, all the SS were declared a criminal organization, an organization dedicated to committing crimes against humanity, far beyond just war crimes. That's why, during the trials, Waffen-SS officers were at great risk. Some of them even faced the risk of being hanged. However, it should be noted that, although the number of death sentences was high in proportion, 71% of those convicted were sentenced to death. He belonged to the Waffen-SS, or at least held a rank within the Waffen-SS. Many commanders did not receive the maximum penalty. We're talking about well-known commanders. Let's think about Felix Steiner, whose name probably rings a bell for those who remember the famous outburst of Hitler, also immortalized in a well-known film. And, along with him, Sepp Dietrich. Yes, him, the founder of the Leibstandarte, or Joachim Peiper, the man who will always be an inspiration in cinema. For at least two characters, the ruthless commander of the armored troops in the Battle of the Bulge, and General Tanz in the Night of the Generals. All these commanders will eventually receive prison sentences, but they will be able to live out their old age in peace. Above all, what emerges from the experience of this terrible Praetorian Corps, the Waffen-SS, in addition to their ruthlessness, in addition to their technological superiority, using the most modern weapons, even beyond having priority. As for the plasma available in case of injury on the battlefield, with the blood type tattooed under the armpit, does that remind you of anything? It reminds us of the blind and absolute loyalty to the dictator, the sometimes irrational fanaticism, the ruthlessness, but also the efficiency. A few years after the war, a former Waffen-SS officer would say that today the Bundeswehr, that is, the current German army, might last a week against any well-trained Western Allied army, and wouldn't last even a day against the Soviets. The Waffen-SS could hold out against a far superior enemy and for a long time. Probably thanks to the equipment, the training, but also to that fanaticism that ran through their ranks. A dangerous fanaticism, a fanaticism that sometimes turned into psychopathy and madness. A fanaticism that let some Waffen-SS members survive the war, but at a high cost. In human lives across many territories, battlefields, but also in ordinary towns here in Italy, in France, in the Balkans, and of course in Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. So today we can ask ourselves, how dangerous is an ideologized Praetorian Guard with renewed loyalty to a dictator? And with the availability, actually the absolute priority over weaponry, in my opinion, the danger is significant. And that's why it's always wise to be wary when security solutions involve creating forces like these.